We're going to start a short series. Should be roughly 4 weeks long. Looking at this subject of clearing out anxiety. And I wanted to start with this. I know my intention is to get into doing some of the answering questions and what have you as we progress through the year. But this is one of those subjects that everywhere you look around you, and reality is quite possibly you look at your own life, all we see around us is anxiety and worry. Worry about COVID, worry about life. The list goes on and on and on. And we have become a people as a nation, and probably not limited to the United States for that matter, who have almost become paralyzed by our fears and our anxieties and our worries. And to the point that we probably have more people seeing psychologists, therapists, taking different forms of medication to try to help deal with this stuff. And I'm not passing any judgments on any of those things, because we have to find what tools we can use to deal with it. It is a very real issue, a very real subject. But that's why I wanted to start with that as we enter this new year from a scriptural perspective, from a spiritual perspective, which I think is our greatest tool. Again, not saying those other things don't have their place, are not a part of maybe a solution. But with everything, our greatest solution lies with the one that created us, with God. And so before we get into those other things, I wanted to spend a couple of weeks dealing with this subject with kind of two hopes in mind. One, that we draw ourselves closer to God, which is the hope for every study that we do. The second is that we are able to rid ourselves of some of these anxieties that hinder our walk with God, because they are crippling, they are paralyzing. And it's hard to walk with God when you're paralyzed by fear. When anxiety and worry are the things that rule your life rather than the path that God has. We're going to begin this study looking, and this is kind of going to be our key verse launching pad for all four in the series. But we're going to begin with looking at Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. And Paul writes to the church of Philippi there and says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Now, as Paul writes this, that very first verse, always rejoice. Well, that alone is a pretty hard task. And in reality, we understand that there are proper times for mourning. There are some proper times for sadness and solemnness in our lives that Paul is saying, oh, look, you've just got to laugh and smile and joke your way through everything. He's not saying that. But he is telling us, look for the ways to find joy in Christ, to look for the ways to find joy in God. But As difficult as that one seems, the next statement is the harder one. Be anxious, or do not be anxious about anything. The reality of it is, most of us have PhDs in anxiety. We have the full doctorate level education in it. Not how to deal with it, not how to overcome it, but in how to have it. I saw one statistic that said 91% of Generation Z, which is the current high school and college age kids, 91% feel significant stress in their lives due to worry and anxiety. I don't remember feeling that stressed when I was high school and college age. I probably had some. I won't say I didn't have any anxiety, any worry, but not to the point that today's generation feels it. But as I got older, got into quote unquote adulthood and adulting, as they call it today, my levels of stress, my levels of anxiety, my levels of worry went up. I had those nights where they were sleepless nights because I was worried about whether the check I wrote that day was going to clear the bank. I had those moments of worrying about my kids, whether they were safe, what they were doing. Those things that build and add up as we go through life. We worry, it seems, about everything: our future, our children, our marriages, our jobs, our schedules. And the list goes on and on about the things that we find to worry about. And at some point, we end up getting to that proverbial end of the rope. And you know the old saying is, well, when you get to the end of the road, just tie a knot and hold on. Well, the problem with that sentiment is it's assuming that I can have the strength to tie a knot when I'm doing good just to hold on to the rope to start with. But the bigger problem is it thinks that I've got enough strength to hold myself on the rope. And as we're going to talk about, as we're going to see, that's one of our problems, is trying to rely on our own strength. As we talk about this, our secondary passage that we're going to use for this week and looking at is going to be the example of Elijah. And as we look at the story of Elijah, 1 Kings chapter 17 and the next couple of chapters, and I'm just going to give you, for the sake of time, kind of the rundown of chapter 17 and 18. Elijah comes to King Ahab, and in dealing with the sins of King Ahab and the sins of the people, God has sent Isaiah to deliver a message. And the message is, the punishment is going to be a drought. There's going to be a hardship that's going to come upon the land. And so through God's direction to to Elijah, Bible class is coming back up in there talking about Isaiah all morning. Through Elijah, God is delivering the message of 3 years worth of drought. No rain at all. Nothing to quench the land. And during that time, God tells Elijah, while this is going on, I'm going to take you to a place of safety because the people are going to be upset with you for this prophecy. And so he takes him to a brook where there's going to be water for him. And he says, I'm going to have the ravens bring you food. And he has Elijah stay there until the drought has become so bad that the stream for the water dries up. And at that point, he sends Elijah to meet the widow at Zarephath. And when he gets there, he asks for a drink of water. She's willing to give him that. And he says, while you're doing that, bring me some bread. And she tells him, I've got just enough bread for me and my son to eat it, and then we're going to die. And so Elijah, through the guidance of God, tells her, if you'll make it and bring it out here, the jar of flour and the jar of oil will not run dry until it rains again. And he stayed there with her, and she continued to bake bread, and they continued to have something to eat and something to drink, until finally God said, it's time for you to go back and end the drought. While he was there, her son took ill and died. And through Elijah, God brought him back to life. So the point of all that within those two chapters that I'm trying to get at is God, time after time, despite the stress, despite the things that were going on in his life, despite the worries and the anxieties that he could have, God continued to provide. God continued to take care of him. And yet, despite that, all of this was building up on the mind of Elijah. He returns as he's about to end the drought, and he ends up in the showdown on Mount Carmel with the 450 priests of Baal. They make their sacrifice, and they pray for their gods to consume it with fire, and nothing happens. You may remember the story. Elijah builds his altar, puts his sacrifice on it. They pour all the water over the top of it until it's completely drenched, and the ditch surrounding it is filled with water. And he prays, and the fire comes down from heaven and consumes it all. They then destroy the prophets of Baal. And when he does, Queen Jezebel makes a vow that she is going to have Elijah killed. And at that point, it becomes too much for Elijah. He runs. And so we pick up the story in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 3 through 5. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came to a broom bush, and he sat down under it and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. And then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. And all at once an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. We see Elijah arrive at this moment of being at the end of his rope. The weight, the cares, the concerns, all of it outweighed what he had seen God already doing in his life. The focus had become about something different to him. And so for the remainder of today's lesson, we're going to talk about four things, that common mistakes that Elijah made that we often make ourselves. And this will set the stage for our other lessons in this series as we then, what do we do about these mistakes? The first of these is we run ourselves into the ground. Elijah, while everything that he did was from God, he felt the pressure of it as if it was from himself. Yes, he was God's servant. Yes, he was doing what God said, but he felt the concerns of the people for the drought. He felt the concerns of the widow, of the lack of food, of the death of her son. He felt the concerns and the weight of the battle to prove who was really God as he battled the prophets. And then When Jezebel says such a strong oath upon my own life, I'm going to kill you by tomorrow. The weight of that became more than he could take. It was a hectic life. And we've got to remember, even when we're serving God, we can let life get too hectic. But most of us don't have that excuse, the serving God part. And I don't say that to sound maybe quite the way it sounds when I say that, but we serve God, but we tend to serve God at our own pace and our own rate, not the way Elijah was. Even as a minister, I probably don't serve God to the pace that God would like me, or all the things that God would like me to do. I have a lot of shortcomings, I know. But we allow the rest of life to become too hectic, too filled with everything else, to the point that we feel short of time all the time. I don't have enough time for my job to be successful at it. I don't have enough time for my family, for me to enjoy my children growing up, or to enjoy time with my spouse. I don't have time to enjoy my retirement. I don't have time to, whatever it is, the list goes on and on. And why don't we have time? Because we're busy cramming it with something. Not necessarily the things we want to do, or necessarily the things we ought to do, or the things God is calling us to do, but we just always on the go. We run and run until we can't do anymore. And in the process, the weight of everything begins to feel like it's on our shoulders. Our mind begins to worry about all of that. How am I going to have enough time to do that? I know I've got to do that, but where am I going to find the time? I know I ought to go do this, but and one of the greatest things we can learn how to do sometimes is say no. No, I can't take on that responsibility. No, I can't take on that task because my plate is already full. The second problem that we run into, and the reality is these are kind of a domino effect or a snowball effect. We run ourselves into the ground, and in the process of doing that, we begin to shut out the people closest to us. We begin to isolate ourselves. The passage we read there, 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life, and when he came to Beersheba, he left his servant there. The one who was there to help him, the one who was there to help take some of the weight off of him, to assist him in matters of life, matters of service. And I think probably Elijah felt like, that's just one more person that I'm responsible for. It's one more person that I'm putting in danger, just like I did, or like the widow thought I did with her son by being at her house. So let me leave you behind, and I'll just go off out here in the wilderness, and I'll do everybody a favor, and I'll just die. And the more we shut ourselves out, the more we shut other people out, the more we isolate ourselves, the more we worry. The more we worry, the more we isolate. It builds on itself. And the closer we get to the end of that rope, the closer we get to that point of being like Elijah, who says, I just want to go out here and lay down and die. I've done everything I can do. I don't know how to do anything else. I don't know how to do it any better. And everything that I have done has accomplished nothing. If we look down a few verses later, when God begins to question Elijah about this attitude of why he wants to lay down and die, he says, I've carried your messages, and the people haven't listened. They haven't learned anything from 3 years of drought. They haven't learned anything from the battle on Mount Carmel. They're still after my life, and I'm the only one left, isolated in his mind. God will go on to tell him, you're not alone. You're not the only one. I've got 7,000 who have been in need. But Elijah, boy, my names are wanting to confuse today. Rolling off the tongue wrong. Elijah didn't know about those 7,000 because he was at this point of stress and worry and self-isolation. And the more we shut ourselves off, the more we feel alone. The heavier the burden becomes, the faster we reach the end of the rope. And it leads to the third domino. The more it happens, the more we focus on the negative. The heavier the burdens begin to feel, the more isolated I become, the more my focus shifts to the negative. Everything always goes wrong for me. Why has this happened to me? Everything's so bad, life, it can't get better. I'm too far gone. I'm too sinful. I'm too whatever. My sins are too great for forgiveness. The list of things we begin to think and focus on grows more and more and more. And the negative thinking is what drives us further and further down the rope. It weakens our grip. And again, we're going to see as we look at the other lessons in this series, we've got to get to the understanding it's not about my strength holding me on to the rope. It's not about a knot that can't slip through my hands. Because all of this leads to the fourth mistake, and the biggest mistake that Elijah was making is that in the process we forget about God. Not only do we isolate ourselves from each other, not only do we isolate from family, from friends, from church, we isolate from God. And yes, there probably comes a point where we feel like we've lost the rope completely. Rock bottom, we might describe it as, where we reach this point and then suddenly we remember God. We don't have to get to that point if we can remember God through the whole process. Thinking about how he's provided, how he's protected, how he's always been there for me. You go back through that story of Elijah. God provided as he prophesied about the drought and said, I've got a safe place for you to go be in this. Providence of God, protection of God. There's water there. When water's going to be running out everywhere else, there's going to be water there. Sustenance for your life. And not just water, I'm going to have birds bring you food. Wow. last time I checked, birds didn't just bring you food. The power of God. That should be one of those things that you look at that, and as Paul wrote, rejoice in the Lord. Every time I start feeling hungry and I see that raven flying in with some food, if I'm Elijah, boy, God, I'm sure glad you're sending another one. What's this one got for me? We tend to be more like the Israelites going through the wilderness. Manna again. Can't we get anything besides this bread, God? Then they get quail till they can't stand quail. For whatever reason, we are people who tend to dwell on the negative of things instead of the positive of what God does for us. The miracle of the oil, the miracle of the flour not running out. Elijah knows that's God. But in his moments of greatest fear and in his moments of greatest weakness and self-isolation, he forgets about those things. God has a message for Elijah. I'm still here. We're going to look at it in more depth next week, the following passages in chapter 19. As God presents himself to Elijah, as Elijah prays, and as God presents himself and says, I'm still here. I'm still in control. I'm still in charge. I can deal with these things. I can deal with your schedule. I can deal with your isolation. There's 7,000 that haven't been a knee. You're not alone. And even if they weren't there, I'm here. The reality is God's enough. Change your thinking, Elijah. Focus on the positive. And remember to walk with me. We're going to look at all that in more detail next week. And I know this week doesn't necessarily give a lot of answers to the four things that I'm presenting here this morning, but we've got to become aware of them. Our timetable doesn't give me the time to go more depth this morning. But if we don't recognize these things, we can't begin to deal with them in our lives. God says, be still and know that I am God. That's going to be part of our answer to running ourselves in the ground. In a lot of ways, that was the nice thing about this last week while I was going on vacation. It didn't go like I had planned. Didn't get to do all the things I wanted to do and whatever. But what I did get to do was sit around, relax, and spend some time with some people that I don't get to spend a lot of time with. And I got to have some moments of sitting there reflecting on God and what he's done. And for a week, I wasn't running myself in the ground thinking I had to be everywhere at every moment doing everything. So we're going to leave it at that point this morning. I encourage you for this week. Look back at the story of Elijah. See how God was working there. And then take some time this week just to pause. And I know time's hard to find. But find enough to be thinking about your schedule. What role God plays within that schedule? How much time does He get? How much time is spent thinking about the positive things that God is doing in your life? And see how much time you spend wasting, worrying, and agonizing over focusing on the negative things that are happening in your life. Because the reality is, we're going to see through this series, the positives of God far outweigh the negative moments. And when it's all said and done, we're going to find out a couple of things. Either the moments never happened, the bad things that we thought were going to happen never happened. They happened, but they weren't as bad as we thought they were. Or we find out that God was sufficient to get us through. Because the reality is, it's His strength that holds us to the rope. It's His power that's holding us up. And it makes life so that we can do, as Paul wrote, rejoice. So that we can not be anxious about anything and everything. So that we can have the peace of God in our hearts and our minds. The lesson is yours for this morning. Hope you'll